The silence was the first betrayal. It was a structural absence, a load-bearing wall removed from the center of his life without warning. Alex stood in the doorway of the small house he had poured his own sweat into, sealing the windows and sanding the floors, and felt the wrongness of it in his bones. The air was still, holding its breath. It was the kind of quiet that follows a wrecking ball, the dust not yet settled, the finality not yet processed. He had just come home from a 70-hour week on the Miller Tower project, his body a symphony of aches, the satisfying scent of concrete dust and machine grease clinging to his clothes. He had been thinking of Chloe's smile, the way it could cut through his exhaustion like a welder's torch through steel. He called her name. The word was swallowed by the stillness. On the kitchen counter, scrubbed clean to a sterile gleam, sat his single, folded piece of paper. Next to it, catching the weak afternoon light, was her wedding ring. It was placed with a cruel, deliberate precision, a perfect circle of gold that now seemed to him like the mouth of a well, dark and infinitely deep. He did not need to read the note. He already knew its contents, could feel the shape of the words pressed against his heart. He had seen this happen on job sites. A support gives way, a cable snaps, and for a split second, everything hangs in impossible, weightless suspension before the catastrophic collapse. He was in that second now, his hands calloused and mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 small cuts, felt clumsy and foreign as he picked up the paper. The words were neat, a stark contrast to the chaotic demolition of their life. She was sorry. It was not his fault. She had found something more, someone who understood a part of her that he, with his dirt-caked boots and simple devotion, never could. The man's name was Julian, her personal trainer. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. He built skyscrapers that clawed at the clouds, structures of steel and glass meant to last a century, and he was being left for a man who built ephemeral muscles. The note mentioned love, a word that now felt like counterfeit currency. It ended with a final devastating blow, a piece of shrapnel he had not seen coming. "I know this is a lot to ask," the script read, "but Maya needs stability right now. She sees you as a rock. I can't take her with me. Not yet. It's better this way." Maya, his sister-in-law. A 17-year-old girl, all sharp angles and simmering resentment, who had been living with them for the past year after her own parents had imploded. Chloe was her legal guardian. Now, it seemed, he was. The secondary burden dropped on him like a pallet of bricks with a frayed strap. The silence of the house was suddenly filled with the roar of this new, terrifying responsibility. He was no longer just a man abandoned. He was a guardian, a sole provider, a captain of a ship that was already half submerged. He sank onto one of the kitchen chairs he had assembled himself, the wood solid beneath him, a mockery of the foundational rot that had taken hold of his world. He did not feel anger, not yet. He felt only a vast, hollow numbness, the echo of a structure that was no longer there. The faint, cloying scent of Chloe's perfume, a flowery thing he'd never liked, hung in the air like a ghost, the last remnant of a life that had been dismantled and hauled away. If stories about resilience, the price of loyalty, and the kind of love that survives the wreckage speak to you, stay with me. The first weeks were a blur of dust and autopilot. Alex moved through his life like a ghost, haunting the girders of his own past. He went to work, he swung a hammer, he poured concrete, he read blueprints, whose intricate lines now seemed to mock the simplicity of his own unraveling. The physical labor was a mercy. It allowed him to turn his mind off, to channel the formless rage and grief into the brute force of muscle and bone. His hands, already scarred, took on new wounds, a slipped wrench, a grazed knuckle, a splinter of rebar. He barely felt them. They were just external markers of the internal demolition. His crew, men who communicated in grunts and nods, gave him a wide berth. They saw the hollowness in his eyes, the way his shoulders stooped, with a weight that had nothing to do with the bags of cement he carried. The house was a different kind of hell. It was no longer a home, but an archaeological site of a dead marriage. Chloe's absence was a physical presence. The empty space in the closet where her clothes had been. The bathroom counter cleared of her legion of bottles and jars. The indentation on her side of the bed that his body refused to roll into during the long, sleepless nights. He and Maya orbited each other in a tense, silent dance of shared abandonment. She was a mirror of his own pain, but hers was laced with the volatile fury of adolescence. She saw him as a part of the collapse, a man who had failed to keep her sister, the only anchor she had left. Her bedroom door was a permanent barricade. When she did emerge, her face was a mask of sullen accusation, her words clipped and sharp. He tried. He made dinners that were often burnt or tasteless. He asked about school and received one-word answers. He left money on the counter for her, a pathetic substitute for the connection he had no idea how to build. The house grew messy, a reflection of his internal chaos. Dishes piled up, dust gathered. A stack of bills on the kitchen table grew into a leaning tower of final notices, each envelope a fresh wave of anxiety. He was drowning, and the shoreline was receding with every passing day. The smell of grease and sweat he brought home from the site mingled with the stale air of neglect, creating a miasma of failure. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It was raining, a cold, miserable November downpour that turned the construction site into a sea of mud and misery. He had been reprimanded by his foreman, Henderson, a man whose face seemed permanently carved from granite, for a mistake in a rebar layout. A small thing easily fixed, but in his fragile state, it felt like a verdict on his entire existence. He drove home, the windshield wipers struggling to keep time with the frantic beat of his heart. The house was dark. Maya was not home yet. On the counter, next to the teetering pile of bills, was a new envelope. It was from Maya's high school. An attendance warning. She had been skipping classes. He stood there, rain dripping from his jacket onto the worn linoleum, and stared at the letter. It was such a small thing, a piece of paper, but it was the final straw, the single pebble that triggers the landslide. It was the realization that he was not just failing himself, he was failing this girl who had been entrusted to him. He was not the rock Chloe had claimed him to be. He was just rubble. He saw the burnt pot from last night's disastrous attempt at chili still sitting on the stove. He saw the red stamped "overdue" on a utility bill. He saw the ghost of his wife's smile, her easy laughter, and the gaping maw of its absence. Something inside him snapped. It was not a loud, explosive sound. It was a quiet, internal shearing of metal, a support beam groaning under too much weight, and finally giving way. A single, ragged sob escaped his throat, a sound so foreign and raw he barely recognized it as his own. He braced his hands on the counter, the same counter where her ring had sat, and his legs gave out. He slid down the cheap laminate cabinets to the floor, the dampness of his clothes seeping into him, a cold that felt like it was reaching for his very bones. He pulled his knees to his chest and wept. He wept for his lost wife, for his broken home, for the boy who had believed in forever, and for the man who was now buried under the ruins of it all. It was a silent, gut-wrenching collapse, there in the dark of the kitchen, with the rain beating a merciless tattoo on the roof above. He had hit the foundation. There was nowhere left to go but up, or to be buried completely. He did not know how long he sat there on the cold floor, a heap of wet clothes and broken promises. The rain eventually softened to a whisper, and the darkness in the kitchen became absolute. The sound of a key in the lock was what finally roused him. It was Maya. He heard her hesitant steps, the soft click of her bedroom door closing. She had not seen him. He remained on the floor, the storm inside him having passed, leaving behind a chilling, desolate calm. The tears had scoured him clean, washing away the numbness and leaving only the hard, gritty reality of his situation. He was at the bottom. The only thing left to do was to decide whether to lie there and be covered over, or to start digging his way out. Morning came, not with the gentle warmth of hope, but with the flat, grey light of necessity. Alex pushed himself up, his limbs stiff, his back a latticework of pain. He walked to the living room. Maya had fallen asleep on the sofa, still in her clothes from the day before, a textbook open on her chest. Her face, in the soft light of dawn, had lost its hard, defensive edges. She looked young, she looked scared. In that moment, watching the slight rise and fall of her shoulders with each breath, the decision was made. It was not a conscious thought, not a dramatic vow. It was a quiet, internal shift, like a foundation settling onto solid bedrock. He would not sink, he would build. He started in the kitchen. He gathered the pile of bills, the threatening letters, the school notice, and laid them out on the table, not as a monument to his failure, but as a blueprint for his war. He methodically washed every dirty dish, scoured the burnt pot until it shone, and wiped down the counters until the smell of bleach overpowered the ghosts of perfume and neglect. The physical act of creating order from chaos was a balm to his fractured mind. He was a builder. This was what he did. He took broken things and made them whole. He took empty spaces and gave them structure. His own life would be his next project. That day at work he sought out Henderson during the lunch break. Henderson was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience. He was chewing on a sandwich, his eyes scanning a set of plans. "What do you want, Alex?" he asked, not looking up. "Overtime?" Alex said, his voice steady for the first time in months. "I want every hour you've got. Nights, weekends, holidays. Anything nobody else wants, I'll take it." Henderson finally looked at him, his gaze sharp and appraising. He saw the new set of Alex's jaw, the grim resolve in his eyes. He saw a man who had been to the bottom and had started climbing. He simply nodded. "Be here Saturday, 6 a.m. The first step had been taken. The second was a sacrifice. That weekend he cleaned out the garage. In the back, under a dusty tarp, sat his only real treasure, a 1969 Dodge Charger. He and his father had spent years restoring it, a bond forged in grease and chrome. It was a piece of his history, a part of his soul. He polished it until the black paint gleamed like obsidian, the engine roaring to life with a familiar, gut-deep rumble. He drove it one last time, the memories of his father's laughter echoing in the powerful sound. Then he drove it to a used car dealership and sold it for less than it was worth. He did not haggle, he just took the check, a thick stack of bills that felt both heavy and weightless in his hand. He went home and paid every single bill. He laid out a budget on the kitchen table, a strict, unforgiving ledger of income and expenses. The numbers were terrifying, but they were real. They were tangible. They were a problem he could solve with work and discipline. It was on a new job site, a high-end commercial build downtown, that he met Sarah. She was a junior architect, fresh out of school, all sharp lines and focused energy. Their first interaction was adversarial. She found a flaw in the rebar grid he had laid out, a slight deviation from her precise, elegant drawings. She pointed it out, her tone crisp and professional. devoid of apology. He had been defensive at first, his pride stung, but looking at her plans he saw she was right. Her attention to detail was absolute. "You're right," he said, the admission costing him. "We'll fix it." She seemed surprised by his lack of argument. She simply nodded. "Thank you." He saw her often after that. She was always on site, her hard hat a slash of white against her dark hair, her boots as muddy as his. She did not stay in the trailer with the other architects. She walked the skeleton of the building, running her hands over concrete forms, questioning contractors, ensuring her vision was being executed with integrity. She noticed him too. She saw the way he managed his crew, the quiet authority he commanded. She saw the precision in his work, the way he treated the raw materials not as inert objects, but as components of a greater whole. She saw the man, not just the laborer. One evening, working late under the harsh glare of temporary floodlights, she brought him a coffee. "You're here a lot," she said. It was not a question. "Got a lot to build," he replied, his gaze fixed on the half-finished structure rising against the bruised twilight sky. He did not just mean the building. She seemed to understand. She stood beside him in silence, the two of them watching the city lights flicker to life below. Two builders, each in their own way trying to create something permanent in a world that felt anything but. The next 7 years were a montage, written in sweat and exhaustion, a slow, grinding ascent from the trench. Time was measured not in days or weeks, but in completed projects in the changing seasons, viewed from the skeletal frames of rising buildings. Winters were brutal, the cold a physical enemy that seeped into his bones, his fingers clumsy with chill as he knotted rebar ties. Springs brought the smell of damp earth and wet concrete, a scent of renewal that he willed into his own life. Summers were a furnace of asphalt and sun-baked steel, the long days bleeding into short nights of fitful sleep. Autumns were a race against the dying light, a push to get structures sealed before the first snow. He worked through all of it. He took the holiday shifts, the graveyard pause, the thankless jobs. His body became a machine, hardened and efficient, but his mind was where the real construction was happening. The money from the charger and the relentless overtime had stabilized his finances, but it was not enough. He wanted more than survival. He wanted to build an empire, however small, of his own making. In the slivers of time between work and sleep, he studied. He filled notebooks with equations for load-bearing capacities and tensile strengths. He earned certifications in project management, in site safety, in welding. He enrolled in night classes at the community college, his calloused hands looking alien as they held a pen in a brightly lit classroom filled with kids younger than Maya. The smell of sawdust and rebar on his clothes was replaced 2 nights a week by the smell of old books and cheap coffee. He was building a new foundation, not of concrete, but of knowledge. His relationship with Henderson, his gruff foreman, evolved. Henderson saw the fire in Alex's eyes, the relentless hunger. He started giving him more responsibility, first a small crew, then a whole section of a project. They clashed, Alex's new book learning sometimes running up against Henderson's decades of gut instinct. But the arguments were built on a bedrock of mutual respect. One afternoon, standing on the top floor of a newly completed office tower, looking out over the sprawling city, Henderson clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got a good eye for the bones of a thing, Alex," he'd said, the highest praise the man was capable of. A year later, Henderson made him a foreman. The tools in his hands began to change. The hammer and trowel were slowly replaced by a clipboard, then a rolled-up set of blueprints. The dirt under his fingernails became less permanent. He was moving from building the thing to building the team that built the thing. Through it all, Sarah was a quiet, constant presence. Their professional respect had slowly, cautiously blossomed into something more. Their courtship was not one of dinners and movies, but of late nights in the site trailer, poring over schematics. It was of walks through half-finished structures, the city lights a glittering carpet below them, their conversation a mix of structural engineering and personal histories. She spoke of her love for clean lines and functional beauty, of creating spaces that served people. He spoke of his father, of the charger, of the simple satisfaction of making something with his own hands. He never spoke of Chloe. He did not have to. Sarah saw the empty space in his life, not as a void, but as cleared ground, ready for a new design. The first time he held her hand, it was an impulse. They were on the roof of a parking garage he was managing, the project behind schedule. The air was tense. He had been explaining a complication with a post-tension slab, his hands sketching in the air, and he had reached out and taken hers to make a point about stress and support. Her fingers were cool and smooth against his rough palm. A current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that this was about more than concrete. He did not let go, she did not pull away. That single point of contact was more intimate, more real than any of his memories of Chloe. It was a connection built not on fleeting passion, but on shared purpose, on the slow-cured mortar of respect and admiration. His life with Maya was undergoing its own reconstruction. In the beginning, he was simply a provider, a stoic, often absent presence. But his consistency became its own form of communication. He was always there. He attended the parent-teacher conferences, a hulking, awkward figure in his work boots among the polished parents. He sat with her at the kitchen table, the two of them silently working, her on her calculus homework, him on his engineering textbooks. He taught her how to drive in his beat-up work truck, his patience a stark contrast to the truck's rattling groans. He was there to see her graduate high school, a solitary figure in the back of the auditorium, his pride a quiet, fierce ache in his chest. The sullen resentment in her eyes had slowly been replaced by a grudging respect, which then matured into genuine affection. She saw the sacrifices he made, the exhaustion he tried to hide. He had not replaced her sister, but he had become her family. When she got accepted into the State University's architecture program, a choice she made, she later admitted, after watching him and Sarah. He sold some stock he had been painstakingly accumulating and paid her first year's tuition. She had cried, and for the first time she had called him not Alex, but family. 5 years after Chloe left, Henderson, his hair now more salt than pepper, called Alex into his office. He was retiring. He offered Alex a partnership in the company he had built from the ground up. Alex, feeling the weight of the offer, countered with a proposal of his own. He wanted to start a new division, a boutique firm under the Henderson construction umbrella, focusing on high-end, architecturally complex residential and commercial projects. The kind of projects Sarah designed. It was a risk. Henderson considered it for a long, silent moment, then a slow grin spread across his weathered face. He agreed. 2 years later, Alex was no longer an employee. He was the owner of Vector Construction. The name, Sarah's idea, represented direction and magnitude. His hands were clean now, more accustomed to the sleek metal of a designer pen than the rough grain of a hammer. He wore tailored suits that smelled of wool and success, not sweat and sawdust. His office was on the 20th floor of a building he had helped manage, with a panoramic view of the city he was now helping to shape. He and Sarah were a team in work and in life. They lived in a minimalist house on a hill overlooking the city, a structure of glass, steel, and warm wood that he had built and she had designed. It was their first joint project, a testament to their shared vision. Maya, now in her mid-20s and a promising intern at Sarah's firm, was a frequent guest for dinner. They were a family, forged not by blood but by choice and shared struggle. The ghosts of the past had faded, the ruins of his old life now just a distant memory, a foundation upon which he had built something stronger, something true, something that was finally, unequivocally, his. The ghost appeared on a crisp October afternoon. Alex was in his office, the cityscape a stunning, sun-drenched panorama behind him, when his assistant buzzed him. "There's a woman here to see you, Mr. Travers. A Chloe Martin. She doesn't have an appointment." The name struck him with the force of a physical blow, a phantom pain from a long-healed wound. For a moment, the sleek, air-conditioned quiet of his office was replaced by the ghost scent of cheap perfume and the echo of a too-silent house. He had not heard that name, had not allowed himself to even think it, for 7 years. He had assumed she was a closed chapter, a demolished building whose rubble had long since been cleared away. "Send her in," he said, his voice a low, steady calm that he did not feel. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, turning his back to the door. He needed to see his city, to see the tangible proof of the life he had built, to anchor himself in the present before the past walked through the door. He watched the traffic flow like blood through the city's concrete arteries, tracing the skyline until his eyes rested on the Miller Tower, the project he had been working on the week she left. It stood as a monument to how far he had come. The soft click of the door opening behind him was a sound he had been unconsciously dreading for years. "Alex?" Her voice was different. The confident, musical lilt was gone, replaced by a thin, reedy uncertainty. He turned around slowly. The woman standing in his office was a faded photograph of the one he remembered. The vibrant, sun-kissed beauty had been weathered away, leaving behind a woman who looked tired and worn. Her clothes, an attempt at a chic that now just looked cheap, hung on a frame that was too thin. The arrogant spark in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a desperate, hungry flicker. The trainer, Julian, was nowhere to be seen, but his failure was written all over her. "Chloe?" he said. His tone was flat, neutral. He was a builder, inspecting a site, assessing for structural weaknesses. He gestured to one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. "Please." She perched on the edge of it, looking small and out of place against the backdrop of his success. The office, with its clean lines, its expensive art, its commanding view, was a weapon, and he saw in her eyes that it was hitting its mark. She was here because of this. She had seen his name somewhere, a magazine article about a new project, a society page with him and Sarah at a charity gala, and had come looking for a lifeline. She launched into her story, a practiced monologue of victimhood and regret. It was a carefully constructed narrative designed to elicit pity. Julian, the man she had left him for, had been a fantasy. His charisma was a thin veneer over a core of weakness and deceit. The gym they had opened, Elysian Fitness, had been a disaster, a money pit built on bad loans and worse management. He had cleaned out what was left of their accounts and disappeared months ago, leaving her with a mountain of debt and an eviction notice. She was broke. She was alone. She had nowhere to go. Tears welled in her eyes, but Alex saw them for what they were. Another tool, like the careful application of makeup or a flattering dress. He listened without interruption, his face an impassive mask. He felt nothing, not pity, not anger, not even the ghost of old love. It was like listening to a subcontractor explain why a shipment was late. It was a problem, but it was not his problem. "I made a terrible mistake, Alex," she whispered, leaning forward, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "I was young and I was stupid. I threw away the only real thing I ever had. You." He remained silent, letting the weight of her words hang in the air and collapse under their own insincerity. He had spent years rebuilding his life on a foundation of truth and hard work. Her words were cheap drywall, crumbling at the slightest pressure. "What do you want, Chloe?" he asked finally, his voice cutting through her performance. The question seemed to startle her. The tears stopped, her eyes sharpened, the desperate flicker hardening into a glint of calculation. "I need help," she said. "Alone. Just enough to get back on my feet. For old time's sake." For old time's sake. The phrase was so absurd it was almost comical. For the sake of the sleepless nights, the crushing debt she had left him with, the terrified girl he had to raise, the years of his life he had sacrificed to climb out of the hole she had dug for him. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "No," he said. It was a simple word, delivered without heat or malice. It was a structural fact, a closed door, a wall she could not pass through. Her face hardened, the mask of remorse falling away to reveal the familiar, ugly entitlement beneath. "You can't just say no, Alex. Look at all this. You owe me. I was with you when you had nothing." "You left me with less than nothing," he corrected her, his voice still unnervingly calm. "And then I built this. Me, not you." She stood up, her composure shattering completely. "I'll see you in court," she hissed. "We were never divorced, remember? In this state, that makes half of this." She gestured wildly around the office. "At his life, half of it is mine. My lawyer will have a field day with you." He had expected this. The escalation from pity to threats was as predictable as the setting of concrete. This was her endgame. She believed she held the ultimate leverage, a legal claim to the empire he had built. She thought she could sledgehammer her way back into his life and take what she wanted. She mistook his silence for weakness. She had made that mistake once before. Alex watched her, a cold, quiet satisfaction beginning to build inside him. She had no idea. She had no idea that he was not the same man she had left 7 years ago. That man was trusting and naive. This man was a strategist. This man had been preparing for this day for a very, very long time. The confrontation escalated exactly as he had calculated it would. When her initial plea for pity was met with his calm, unyielding refusal, Chloe's desperation curdled into a venomous rage. The mask of the remorseful victim dissolved, revealing the raw, grasping avarice that had always been her true foundation. She abandoned the pretense of wanting a loan. She wanted a demolition. She wanted to sledgehammer his new life and claim half the wreckage for herself. "You think you can just erase me?" she had snarled in his office, her voice shrill in the serene, soundproofed space. "I am still your wife, Alex. Your wife. That piece of paper means something. It means half of this company, half of that house on the hill, half of everything you have is mine." He had simply looked at her, his silence an infuriating, impenetrable wall. He suggested they meet again in 2 days to discuss the matter. He needed to consult his lawyers. It was a lie, of course. His lawyers had been consulted years ago. He just wanted to give her time. He wanted to let her believe she had him trapped. He wanted to give her enough rope. She used those 2 days to sharpen her attack. She tried to poison the well, calling Maya, who was now a confident young woman of 24, a rising star at Sarah's architectural firm. Chloe had wept over the phone, a torrent of fabricated stories about how Alex had kept them apart, how he had turned Maya against her own sister. Maya listened patiently, her silence a mirror of Alex's own. When Chloe finished her tirade, Maya's response was simple and devastating. "You didn't lose me, Chloe," she had said, her voice cold with a clarity forged in years of watching Alex's quiet, steadfast devotion. "You threw me away. Alex picked me up." Then she had hung up the phone and blocked her number. The final showdown was set for a neutral location, a private conference room at a downtown hotel bar. It was a place of transient anonymity, a fitting venue for the final excision of a transient figure from his life. Alex arrived first. He sat at the polished mahogany table, a single leather-bound folder in front of him. He was not nervous. He felt a profound and chilling calm, the quiet focus of a builder about to execute the most critical phase of a demolition. He had inspected the supports, planted the charges, and was now simply waiting to push the button. Chloe arrived exactly on time, flanked by a slick, hungry-looking lawyer whose suit was a size too tight. The man radiated an oily confidence. He saw Alex, a man with builder's hands, even in a fine suit, and saw an easy mark. They sat opposite him. "Mr. Travers," the lawyer began, spreading his hands on the table as if claiming the territory. "My client, your wife, is prepared to be reasonable. We are willing to dissolve the marriage in exchange for a settlement that reflects her contribution to your early life and her legal entitlement to 50% of the marital assets accumulated since your separation." Alex looked past the lawyer, his eyes fixed on Chloe. "Is that what you want?" he asked. "It's what I'm owed," she said, lifting her chin in a defiant gesture that failed to hide the tremor of anxiety in her hands. Alex did not respond to her. He turned his gaze to the lawyer. "Before we discuss what your client is owed," he said, his voice low and measured, "I think you need to see this." He slid the leather folder across the table. It was not thick. It contained only a few pages. The lawyer picked it up with a dismissive air. He opened it. His smug expression began to slowly dissolve as he read. The color drained from his face. He read the first page, then looked at Chloe with a new, sharp expression. He flipped to the second page, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. He looked back at Alex, the oily confidence gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified respect. He swallowed hard. "What is it?" Chloe demanded, her voice tight with impatience. The lawyer slid the papers back across the table to Alex, his hands now trembling slightly. "I believe we may have been operating under a misunderstanding," he stammered. Alex took the folder. He looked directly at Chloe, who was now staring at him, a storm of confusion and fear gathering in her eyes. "You were right about one thing, Chloe," he said softly. "A piece of paper does mean something." He pulled out the top document. "This is a foreclosure notice for a business called Elysian Fitness. It seems the business defaulted on a substantial commercial loan, a loan, as it turns out, that was secured with a personal guarantee." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The bank, in its due diligence, spent quite some time trying to locate all liable parties. It's funny how a name on a foreclosure notice can find you, even when you've disappeared." He slid the document in front of her. His name was there, printed clearly, next to hers and Julian's. And next to his name was a signature, a crude, obvious forgery. "You and Julian forged my signature," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "Bank fraud, a federal offense. I believe the sentencing guidelines are rather significant." Chloe's face had gone white. "You can't prove that," she whispered. "Oh, I can," Alex said, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. "When the bank contacted me a year ago, I was surprised. So I hired a forensic accountant and a handwriting expert. They produced a rather compelling report. It details not only the loan fraud, but also the half-dozen credit cards you opened in my name the month you left. The ones you maxed out on your little adventure with Julian. Wire fraud, identity theft, it's quite a list. He let the silence stretch, the hum of the hotel's air conditioning the only sound. Chloe's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. "I've been sitting on this information for a year, Chloe," Alex continued, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I was hoping I would never have to use it. I was hoping you would have the decency to stay a ghost. But you didn't. You came back. You came into my office, into my life, and you made threats. You tried to blackmail me with a marriage you abandoned. You tried to use the law as a weapon, so now I'll use it as a shield." He pulled another set of papers from the folder. They were divorce documents drafted by his actual lawyers. "You have two choices," he said, laying them on the table. "Choice one, you sign these papers. They grant me a full and final divorce. You waive any and all claims to any of my assets, past, present, and future. In return, I will not file the police report for fraud and identity theft. I will not forward my accountant's file to the United States Attorney's Office. I will absorb the legal costs of clearing my name from the Jim's loan, and you will walk out of here with nothing, which is precisely what you deserve. You will disappear from my life and from Maya's forever." He paused, his eyes boring into hers. "Choice two, you refuse to sign, and I will bury you. I will use every resource I have, every dollar I have earned, to ensure you are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Your lawyer here knows what that means. It means depositions discovery, a trial. It means your face in the papers, and ultimately, it means prison." He pushed a pen across the table. "The choice is yours. Build a new life from the ashes or burn in them." It was a cold, strategic, and utterly complete dismantling, not of a building, but of a person. He had not raised his voice. He had not shown a flicker of anger. He had simply presented her with the architecture of her own destruction and handed her the demolition charge. The builder had become the demolitions expert. Chloe stared at the pen, then at the divorce papers, her entire world collapsing in the sterile silence of the conference room. The empire she had come to conquer had turned out to be a fortress, and she had just walked, unarmed, into its kill zone. The silence that followed was the most profound one Alex had ever experienced. It was not the empty, waiting silence of the house after she had first left. It was the absolute, finished silence after a controlled demolition when the dust has settled and the structure is gone. Chloe's face was a ruin, all the artifice and bravado stripped away, leaving only the stark, ugly frame of her choices. The lawyer, now pale and sweating, gently nudged the pen towards her. He knew a checkmate when he saw one. With a hand that trembled so violently she could barely hold it, Chloe picked up the pen. Her signature on the divorce papers was a jagged, broken thing, the final scrawl on the blueprint of their failed marriage. She signed every page without reading them, her movements jerky and robotic. When she was done, she dropped the pen as if it were on fire. She did not look at Alex. She could not. She stood up, a hollowed-out shell of a woman, and walked out of the room without a word. Her lawyer, after a brief, apologetic nod to Alex, scurried after her. They were gone. Alex sat there for a long moment, the signed papers a neat stack in front of him. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel a savage glee or the satisfaction of revenge. He felt light. A weight he had been carrying for 7 years, a subconscious burden of unresolved history and potential threat, had been lifted. It was the feeling of taking off a heavy tool belt at the end of a very long, very difficult job. It was the quiet peace of a completed project. He had not vanquished an enemy. He had simply cleaned up the last piece of debris from an old site to make way for the new. He calmly gathered the papers, placed them back in the leather folder, and stood up. He walked out of the hotel, not looking back, and stepped into the bright afternoon sun. The city air, usually thick with the smell of exhaust and commerce, felt clean, fresh. He took a deep breath. He pulled out his phone, but he did not call his lawyer. He called Sarah. She answered on the first ring. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. She had known about the file. She had been his partner in this, as in all things. "It's done," he said. "Are you okay?" He looked up at the skyline, at the towers of glass and steel that pierced the blue canvas of the sky. He saw a crane in the distance, a graceful arm lifting a beam into place, building something new. He saw the future. "I am," he said, and the truth of it resonated deep in his bones. "I'm on my way." He did not go back to the office. He went home. When he pulled into the driveway of the house he had built, Sarah's car was already there. So was Maya's. He walked inside. The house was filled with the warm, inviting smell of roasting chicken and garlic. Laughter drifted from the open-plan living area. Sarah and Maya were at the large kitchen island, a bottle of wine open between them, looking over a set of architectural drawings. A new community arts center they were designing together. They both looked up as he entered, their faces bright with welcome. There were no questions in their eyes, no need to rehash the battle he had just won. They saw the lightness in him. They knew. Sarah came to him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. He held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, a subtle, clean fragrance that was nothing like the ghost perfume of his past. It was the scent of home. Maya came over and gave him a fierce hug. "Hey, you," she said, her smile genuine and full of love. Later that evening, the three of them stood on the wide, cantilevered balcony, the city lights spread out before them like a blanket of fallen stars. The air was cool and clear. Sarah leaned against him, her hand in his. Maya stood beside them, pointing out a constellation. "Look at it," Sarah said softly, her gaze sweeping across the glittering panorama. "All those lights, all those lives, and that one, right there." She pointed to a sleek, elegant tower whose spire was illuminated against the dark sky. It was the headquarters of a tech company, the first project Vector Construction had completed, the one that had put Alex on the map. "You built that?" Alex followed her gaze. He looked at the building, a testament to his ambition and relentless work. He looked at the city he had helped to shape. But then his gaze shifted. He looked at Sarah, at the intelligence and loyalty in her eyes. He looked at Maya, the girl he had raised, now a strong, brilliant woman. This was his empire, not the buildings, not the money, not the name on a letterhead. It was this small, unbreakable circle of love and loyalty, built from the wreckage, founded on trust, and designed to last. "Let's go inside," he said, his arm tightening around Sarah, his other hand finding Maya's shoulder. "It's getting cold." He turned his back on the city, on the monuments to his professional success, and walked back into the warmth and light of the house he had built. He was home.